From Resilient Partners, this is the Resilient Insights Podcast. Every episode offers in-depth insights on the key debates and conversations shaping Washington and the world. From policy to leadership to the lighter side of life, we're your source for thoughtful discussions. So get ready to be informed, inspired, and engaged. Welcome to the Resilient Insights Podcast. I'm your guide on this journey, Joshua Baca, walking you through the intricate world of public policy, leadership, and the lighter side of life. We got an episode today that's going to dive into the hot topic that is dominating the political and business world, and that is the proposed legislation that seeks to regulate TikTok. As we began recording this podcast, the U.S. House of Representatives just voted 352 to 65, with one member voting present in favor of the proposed legislation. There were 15 Republican no votes and 40 Democratic no votes along with this. This follows a 50-0 vote in the House Energy and Commerce Committee, which is one of the preeminent committees that seeks to regulate and has oversight over a lot of these issues. We're going to dive in today a little bit and define what this issue means, how it became to be, and what these implications are from a broader public policy perspective. But I think before we do, we have to dive in and understand the significant reach that TikTok is. It has approximately 1.5 billion active users worldwide. I've seen estimates that there are about 150 to about 170 of those users located here in the United States, and the app has been downloaded more than 3 billion times. The only thing that's comparable to TikTok is the reach and the significance of Meta, which owns Facebook and Twitter and WhatsApp. They have about 3 billion users worldwide. Instagram alone has about 1 billion users, so trailing just behind TikTok. When you compare that to some other social media platform, X, the platform formerly known as Twitter, has about 619 active users, and Snapchat has about 750 million users. What makes TikTok unique is it's really cult following among a younger audience that tends to vote more Democratic, if we're being quite honest. They use it to create, they use it to shop, and more importantly, that's increasingly their platform for news information. So, what is the issue here that is causing all of this? Well, TikTok is owned by a company called ByteDance. ByteDance is a Chinese internet company located in China that owns all of the work that TikTok does. And the problem is that TikTok is owned by a Chinese-based company, which presents significant challenges to the US. The problem is that the government of China will either have control or ownership of China-based companies, which really present some challenges for the US. And the major concern centers around data security and privacy. And if this company is requested or required to turn information over to the Chinese government, and if, frankly, they're spying on the US. So, where did all of this begin? I think we have to dive into some of the background and some of the context here. Efforts to scrutinize TikTok began under the Trump administration. There was an executive order under the Trump administration that originally sought to ban TikTok. The end outcome was actually an executive order dealing with some of the data concerns and the data privacy issues, where Oracle was required to partner with TikTok and essentially house their data. And for now, where we're at, as you fast forward today, those who are leading the opposition to this proposed legislation is President Trump. His longtime advisors, Kellyanne Conway, has been reported to be lobbying for TikTok. And one of Trump's top fundraisers is an investor in TikTok, which pits him directly against his opponent in the 2024 election, President Biden, who said he would sign such legislation. How all of this came to be is a really important and unique way because there has been a record of dysfunction in the U.S. House. Inability to elect the speaker, inability to fund the government, an inability to just get basic things done has really paralyzed that institution. But there's one committee in the Congress that working on a more bipartisan basis, and that's the House Select Committee on China. This has been a bipartisan committee. They have been working and scrutinizing a variety of issues when it comes to our relationship with China. And more importantly, I think they're scrutinizing it from the context that we are in a global race of competition between these two countries. It has been the rare committee, as I mentioned, that has operated on a bipartisan basis. And there has been wide support across not just this committee, but across the entire Congress, both the House and the Senate, to address issues of China on a bipartisan basis. Here's what the legislation does. The legislation forces TikTok to divest from ByteDance, their parent company, within 6 months. If they don't find a buyer within 6 months, they will be banned in the United States. Enforceability for banning TikTok will largely fall on the app store provider. So think the Apple App Store or the Google Play Store, who will face significant civil penalties if they continue to offer the app as a platform that can be downloaded from their app store. Along those lines, the legislation itself has sparked massive mobilization by the TikTok community. But I think it's important to understand that they weren't necessarily prepared for this. The Wall Street Journal ran an article today that talked about how TikTok was caught off guard by some of the latest and rapid action that was mobilized against them. And they tried to move quickly. One of the first things that they did was send a push notification to their user base, asking them to call their members of Congress. There have been numerous news reports about how members of Congress were flooded with calls. A lot of those calls, however, had no idea why they were calling, and I think it actually created some momentum against TikTok as opposed to momentum in favor of it. They also received the cold shoulder on Capitol Hill. They've had their CEO on the Hill trying to meet with members of Congress. There just hasn't been a ton of interest right now, and I'm not entirely sure that any one of these things are really gonna change the dynamic or the opinions on how they, view this issue. I think it's pretty safe to say that both of those issues backfired, and it backfired because I think there's so much emotion behind this and a much bigger debate happening in the background, which has less to do about an app or a social media platform as much as it has to do with competition with China. What are the viewpoints of the legislation? I think you could really break it down into two things. Those who are in favor of the legislation are largely citing national security concerns. And in fact, the support that they have received from the Biden administration has come from the various intelligence agencies who have said that they pose a significant risk to national security, meaning that one, they could be feeding US users propaganda, particularly in an election year, which would be unhelpful. Or two, they may be required by the Chinese government to hand over the data that is collected on this platform to the Chinese government. In fact, the thing that makes the TikTok app so popular is the effectiveness of their algorithm. And the effectiveness of their algorithm is largely based upon the data that they have collected. If you've ever been on TikTok before and you watch a video about how to cook chicken, the next time you log in, you're going to get 10 or 20 of those videos that feed you content that are very, very similar. So it's a very effective algorithm. Those who are opposing the legislation have largely made a free speech argument. They say that this is not the right way to go about dealing with an issue like this, and that we are ultimately going to be limiting speech for Americans who utilize this platform. So, where does that all leave us? Well, right now, I think it's safe to say that momentum is on the side of banning TikTok. I think the central and key question here is what will the Senate do? Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer said he needed to talk to his leadership team and his chairs, which was kind of code word that he probably was hoping he didn't have to address this issue. But I do think there's gonna be some sort of action here because this is a rare area where there is bipartisan support. What might also come of this, which some of those who are opposed to banning TikTok have said, is it might spark a broader debate upon data security and regulation of social media companies writ large. Many people who have been arguing against such a ban on TikTok have said that this is the true issue here. And even some of those who have opposed the ban said that if you ultimately ban TikTok, the ultimate winner is going to be Facebook, who will gain many of those users. So, where does that all leave us? Well, here's my 2 cents on all of this. I think something's gonna happen. Something's gonna happen is because, well, the Congress itself has shown that they lack the seriousness to address critical issues facing our time. On my previous episode with Jennifer Betts, we talk about the CHIPS Act in the context of the proposed merger between Nippon Steel and US Steel Corporation, and the lessons that we should learn from the CHIPS Act. The CHIPS Act was legislation to ensure that more chips were manufactured here in the United States as opposed to Asia. So I think it's just one of those issues where there is some serious leaders who care about this issue and who want to address it. I also think we have to remember this in the context of the world that we're living in. Some have called it the new Cold War. While we're not, fighting troops against, American and Chinese forces, what we are doing is we're competing for ideas, intelligence, and a whole host of other things. And this debate about China versus the US centers around technology, sustainable supply chains, and manufacturing, which are very critical to a future world that we're going to live in. I also think the fact that the intelligence agencies have come out and said that they pose a national security threat will probably also be a main reason why the Senate will be forced to address such an issue. I also think it's important to remember there's going to be some political consequences here. As I mentioned, President Trump has flip flopped on this issue. And I think his reasoning for that is he's hoping that younger voters who use TikTok will ultimately turn on President Biden, who favors signing such legislation in the 2024 election. Younger voters tend to vote Democratic. And I guess in theory, you could see something like that happening. So I remain skeptical that that is the case, but President Trump leaves no opportunity behind where he's going to try to seek a political advantage against his opponent. So I think all of that to be said, a lot more needs to happen. This is a fascinating issue that's dominating our discourse right now. It's the hot topic in politics and business world, as I mentioned, and it's going to be, leave some important questions that are going to be left to answer. If the legislation gets enacted, who is capable of buying TikTok? It's probably a handful of companies: Microsoft, Apple, Meta, Elon Musk. Not There's not a lot of companies out there who have the type of money that would be required to buy this. So, with all that being said, I wanted to make a quick plug to my company, Resilient Partners. You can find us on the web at resilientpartners.us. And I wanted to make sure that I had an opportunity here to promote the Resilient Insights newsletter that came out last week. It was actually in this newsletter when we first covered this topic, as the legislation had been moving its way through the congressional committee process. So we use that newsletter as a means to provide thought leadership, analysis, insights on public policy leadership, and as I mentioned, the lighter side of life. And it is usually the foundation for this podcast. So I encourage you to visit my website, resilientpartners.us, where you can learn more about what we do. And most importantly, sign up for that newsletter. You can also find me on all of our social media platforms. Resilient Partners is on LinkedIn, X, Instagram. And of course, now we're trying to make our way onto TikTok as we try to promote this podcast. With all that being said, I also just want to take another moment to thank everybody who has made the Resilient Insights podcast such a quick success. I don't know what I'm doing half the time, but I enjoy talking about it, and I appreciate you listening, and I hope you will continue to listen. My guess is we're going to have much more to discuss on this issue, so stay tuned. With all that being said, until next time, thank you for listening.